There once was a man named Nopopon, who was king of the pirates. He had fame, power, and wealth beyond your wildest dreams. Before they hung him from the gallows, these were the final words he said. Nopopon's fortune is friends for the taking, but friends have to find it first. Me left everything me owns in Garfont, meh. Ever since, pirates from all over the world set sail for all rest, searching for Garfont, and the treasure that would make their dreams come true. Yo! I'm not doing the rest of that. Alright, so classic memes aside, what are we actually here to talk about today? As much as I wish this could be an in-depth discussion on the bounties for various Xenoblade 2 characters were given in-game, that's not a piece of information we're privy to. Yes, there are several wanted posters in Torgoth, but none of those contain any number. The text on them is all the same, and it just mentions that you should contact the authorities if you see the person depicted on it, not even saying if there is a reward for their capture whatsoever. We do know that there are driver mercenaries, and I would not be surprised if there were driver bounty hunters as well, but that doesn't seem to be a thing the Ardanian military is particularly advertising to, and the posters are more of a, these are dangerous people you should look out for. Another issue is that we can't trust the economy that we see in-game for actual numbers. Most prices of things and the rate at which you obtain money for things is a gameplay arbitration designed for a comfortable and balanced game experience and not a direct one-to-one recreation of what things would cost and pay in-universe. We are, however, given a few absolutely 100% in-canon pieces of monetary information though, so I'm going to try and use those and basically backdoor hack my way into Allrest's monetary system and figure out, at least in a very rough, probably only order of magnitude estimate, what the bounties for various characters would be. I guess if you want me to come full circle with the opening joke, I could make a what would these characters' bounties be if they were in One Piece video too, but I make no promises and that is 100% not what we're doing today. Also, while I will not be extrapolating bounties through the endgame, I will need to mention spoilers up through Chapter 8, so keep in mind that that's a thing. The 4 characters we know as a fact are explicitly wanted by the Ardanian military are Jin, Malos, Nia, and Rex. Pyra and Mythar are obviously also sought after due to being the Aegis, but we technically don't know if they're explicitly wanted or have a bounty on their head or anything like that. It's also probably assumed that if you get Rex, you get the other one too. The first 3 we see posters for upon entering Torgoth when Nia tears the bad version of hers up, and after the events of Chapter 2, Jin and Malos' posters are taken down for some reason, and are replaced by a Rex poster because he is now also wanted as the Aegis driver and for destroying the water tower, and Nia's is replaced with a more accurate one because she's been captured and they know what she looks like. Surprisingly enough, Tora never gets a bounty out on him or seems to be wanted whatsoever besides his association with the other characters, despite the fact that he was also there for breaking a criminal out of a Titan battleship, and for assaulting a consul and the Special Inquisitor. I guess he was just so small they didn't notice. That's the only explanation I have. And again, it is also worth noting that these are Ardanian bounties. The party is not wanted criminals in Uriah. People just want them because the Aegis is with them, so they have to lay low and be careful and stuff anyway. Also, any bounties or criminal status that the party members had is completely redacted in Chapter 4 when Rex and Morag agree to join forces. Perhaps initially it is just, oh, this is a stay of your warrant, we're not going to go after you as long as we're working together, but if you try to pull anything else, we'll capture you again and round you up and stuff. But obviously once Morag formally joins the party at the end of Chapter 4 and the beginning of 5, then there's no question about it. They've met the Emperor and stuff. They are not wanted criminals, especially because they're being accompanied by the Special Inquisitor. Rex absolutely is, and Nia probably also is, an unregistered driver, so they'd be wanted by Indal in addition to that, but that is also probably completely irrelevant by the time they meet with Amalthus because he clearly doesn't care. Based on all of that, the fact that there are not posters for the Aegis herself, Dromark, and Poppy, and the fact that no one knew that Jin, Malos, and Nia were Blades, I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that in driver blade pairs, the driver is the one who is wanted, presumably because if you capture or kill them, they can't do anything with blades, whereas if you get their blade, they can just awaken another one and continue their crimes. So, extrapolating, we can reasonably assume that Akos, Patroka, and Mikhail, despite all being some degree of blades themselves, also would be wanted, while Abrona, Sever, Cressitus, and Perdido would not be. So, ignoring gameplay exclusive stuff and Shiba's quest, what are the explicit mentions of money? Well, there's the obvious meme, the
100,000
that Rex is given as part of the salvaging job for Torna, but there are a few things mentioned about that in the first place. Rex says that that much money would be enough to buy a cutting-edge salvaging suit. We don't know if it's this 100k is exactly enough to get the thing, even with tax included, but it's more of a, you could buy it with that amount, and the amount it costs is well out of Rex's normal wheelhouse. It is worth mentioning that he says this about the 100,000 and not about the 200,000 he would get after completing the job. It's a completely separate thing. The Abyss Vest item, which is, I guess, a better piece of a salvaging suit, but not necessarily a cutting-edge one, that you are required to buy as part of the tutorial, costs 5,000 gold, and the shopkeeper Shinini, in quest-exclusive dialogue, says that it would take a big treasure in order to have enough money to comfortably buy one. And the tutorial also says that the vest is something Rex always wanted. A bit later on in the story, Melolo refers to 2,000 as a big sum, suggesting that Rex usually doesn't have that amount or more on hand at one time. Max, the guy that is the middleman for Rex sending money home to Fonset, calls 90,000 something from a huge treasure, implying that it would take a huge treasure for Rex to be able to get that much money at one time. In other senses, outside of Argentum, Nia's quote-unquote father was the Lord of Eshel, a region in Gormod. And this is worth noting because Nia mocks Rex for getting excited about only 100 grand, meaning that either Torna has a significantly larger amount of money than that, which presumably they could get from just doing crimes, or that Nia has experience having a lot more money than that, which seems to imply that, yes, 100,000 is a lot for someone like Rex, but for someone in the upper echelons of society like a lord, although he admittedly did lose it later on and Nia was privy to that too, but she was there and he was rich, 100,000 is nothing. All of Poppy's parts totaling to 60,000 is what prompted Rex's "you want a kidney as well" remark, which makes sense because 60,000 is over half of 100,000 and it's already been well established that Rex usually sees nowhere near that much money. The important thing about the 60,000 is Pyra says her natural crystal earring would probably fetch enough to pay off the Poppy parts, and Pyra has been awake for only a couple days in the present, so we're not entirely sure if she's still using 500-year-old logic for that, so it's possible that with inflation and all that stuff, and just the general scope of economics changing over half a thousand years, that it would be worth possibly a whole lot more. I kind of doubt that it would be worth less because Titans are dying, there's less land, there's less access to resources, so it absolutely would be worth more due to scarcity, but we don't know by how much, or if she's already scoped out the prices of various things in the modern day. So all of that together, what conclusions can we make? Not really any, unfortunately. And that's because Allrest is so far removed from our reality that we just don't know the relative costs of various things, and how all these things work together, or even how much a normal person's income would be. All of that being said, I do still want to come up with a hierarchy of the different characters' bounties, as well as figuring out roughly what they would be. I think I should first off state that by the end of the game, or at least the end of the point where I'm going to be talking about, the most dangerous characters are obviously the members of Torna, and primarily Malos and Jin, and they pose an existential threat to all of Allrest. With that on the line, and the Emperor of Mor Ardain being personal friends with the people trying to stop them, it would absolutely not be unreasonable to assume that the highest bounty present would far exceed the 100,000 Rex was paid for the salvaging job. We can probably back extrapolate that as well, because the Aegis merely existing is also viewed by many as a threat to Allrest, so Rex's initial bounty is probably also in excess of the 100,000, just not massively huge, because I'm guessing the funding for it, at least before Morag was able to report back to the Emperor, would come from mainly Dougal's bruised ego and not from the Imperial coffers themselves. We can also fairly reasonably say that the 100,000 and probably even 200,000 is a reasonable amount of money for Torna to be able to throw away. They actually did give 100k to Rex before he embarked on the salvaging job, and it seems like the initial plan was to not show Pyra to anyone and just walk away, not killing anyone either, before Rex awakened Pyra when they decided they had to kill everyone to get rid of the evidence. So it seems like they were going to hold up on their end of the bargain and give Rex the other 100k afterwards. So it seems like even with all of the massive amounts of money they need to be pouring in to keep the Monoceros up and running, because, 500 years old, you're not going to be able to buy parts for that off a shelf. And then also the Marsanes, which is an even bigger deal, and you have absolutely seen that by the end of chapter 8. So they clearly needed a lot of money, but even with that, 200k was a small enough amount for them to be able to just kind of throw at Rex, not really care about. And again, this also backs up Nia's statement that 100,000 is a measly amount. So with all that being said, we could pretty safely assume that a higher end bounty being over 1 million and possibly even into the tens of millions is not completely out of the running. Before we try to come up with any concrete numbers, let's do a little qualitative reasoning on the various bounties first. As far as we can tell, the event that caused the members of Torna to become criminals was the whole disaster on the Maelstrom and the ancient ship controversy, where a lot of people died and a lot more people almost died. By that point, people already knew that the Monoceros existed and was a powerful warship, and that Jin was a powerful being without being a driver, although he was assumed to be human, Nia was a member of Torna, and Malos was also a pretty good driver. They might have been regarded as terrorists beforehand because they'd clearly been hijacking core crystal supplies and clearly probably killing people and taking money from them long before then, but they might not have been identified as a specific group until then, because it was Rex's heroics that were able to basically get the people who had seen their faces and all that out of the way. It's also again worth noting that the only wanted Torna members we know about are the 3 that did the salvaging job and were there on the ancient ship, so the profile thing probably came from Bana or other Argentum officials. We would also obviously know that by the end of chapter 4, Nia and Morag probably would have talked enough to establish who the other members of Torna were, and by using other testimonies from like Rex and Tora and friends, they would be able to say, yeah, these guys also need to be looked out for, so at least post chapter 4, Akos, Petroka, and Mick would also clearly be wanted. It's also worth mentioning that even within chapter 2, just when Nia first gets captured, it's already explicitly known that Rex and Pyra are not members of Torna, and that Nia is acting apart from Torna. So, while the Aegis being there is a big deal, I think personally that Rex and Nia, even post-escape and post-water tower, their bounties would be explicitly determined based on what they did, which was attack a consul of the government, fight the Special Inquisitor to a draw, and successfully escape after breaking Nia out of prison. So we're just gonna say Tora is part of that group too, because he deserves a bounty. But I think that that's gonna be lower than the Torna ones because they have a warship, and after knowing that they're criminals, they might have been able to tie that back to previous instances of core crystals getting taken or other people getting murdered or robbed or something, based on just eyewitness testimonies of what Jin and Malos are capable of doing. So in that case, as far as the party members go, and again we're only counting drivers, the order would probably be Nia with the highest bounty because she escaped from prison, and she was a member of Torna and a member of the Aegis's party, so she has intel on both of them that could potentially help an investigation either way. Then Rex as the Aegis driver, and then Tora as a guy who's basically there, because it probably also takes until chapter 4, when everyone gets to see the factory, that people realize that artificial blades exist and Poppy is one, and again by then the party is no longer wanted, so the only artificial blade criminal related activity is done by Torna. So in that case, upon arrival in Torragoth, Jin and Malos would have the higher bounties, probably roughly equal, and Nia would have a bit lower than theirs. After the end of chapter 2, post-Water Tower incident, I think I would reasonably say that Nia's would go up, probably equaling Jin and Malos. Rex's would be pretty high, but again still not as high as Jin and Malos, because while he does have the Aegis, he doesn't have the bloody warship. and Tora's would easily be the lowest because, as far as they can tell, he's just some guy and doesn't have a lot of intel, while Rex is the Aegis driver and Nia has intel on both Torna and the Aegis party. Unfortunately for the party, however, Morag did not get any information besides the names of Rex and Pyra out of Nia, so she did not have any new information that could be used to increase the wanted level of the other members of Torna, which means that their threat level would be entirely gauged on the fact that they have two powerful fighters and a warship, so just Nia's info on both groups and Rex having the Aegis means that Nia is probably the highest bounty and Rex is not too far behind Jin and Malos. It's also pretty obvious that based on Morag's dialogue, we can say that while the Ardanian army obviously made no effort to capture the party while they were on Oriah, because that would probably be a declaration of war, they were appraised of the situation that took place there and were judging the criminality of the members of Torna and the Aegis party based on things that happened. So all of Chapter 3 is now on the table for basically the bounties that Morag was hunting the party under at the beginning of Chapter 4 during that fight. So the inclusions here are Vandam probably very quickly getting and losing a bounty because he died, and that's just for aiding the Aegis party. He clearly isn't a criminal on his own. Akos getting a bounty, and everyone's getting adjusted. And this is where Rex makes the massive jump because Mithra. And Mithra is the one that broke Alethra Ruins, so yeah. We could reasonably assume that Jin is going to have the highest Torna member bounty after this, just because he's the only one who wasn't defeated, because Malos and Akos obviously were and had to retreat, but all of the members of Torna would get a boost, and I'd say that Akos, who probably has the lowest now, would be equal to, if not exceeding, what Malos and Jin had beforehand, while both Malos and Jin had increases, Jin's being higher, again because it's highly unlikely that any Ardanian spies would get the information that Malos is also an Aegis, because Pyra and Mithra were basically the only ones who knew that beforehand, as well as, I guess, Cole, who clearly wouldn't be talking, and the only time that information was relayed was in a private moment with the rest of the party, so no one else would really be privy to it. As far as our bounty rankings here go, I would say that even the lowest ranking people, besides Vandam probably got a small bounty because he didn't really do many crimes other than aiding another criminal who did other things. And the ones for the people who are ongoing active criminals are being raised because they're obviously stronger and pose a greater threat. So I would say that at this point, with the exception of Vandam, because he got the smallest thing, everyone's bounty would be higher than Chapter 2 Jin and Malos, including Tora, who I'm still guessing would have the second smallest because he didn't really do a whole lot, and while he does have some knowledge, Nia is the only one with knowledge of both big criminal groups. Then, after that, so it would probably be Tora, then Akos, then Nia, then Malos, then Jin, all of whom had increased bounties over their previous one, and Akos's at least being roughly equal to Chapter 2 Jin and Malos, and then Rex with a significantly higher bounty than anyone had seen before, possibly by like a factor of 2, because Mithra is a big deal. After that, we only have 2 bounty increases for the main party, and one of them only applies to Tora. The first is the early Chapter 4 increase, which is probably going to be a very small bump just for the fact that, oh, they were able to get from Oriah back to Gormod, because they didn't really do any more crimes there. All they did was show up, but the fact that they did show up might merit a slight increase, like I'm saying 10% at most, basically just because they're able to get from Oriah to Gormod and then 2 more Ardane, which is sort of a big deal. And then we have a 1 character exclusive bounty increase, and that is Tora getting one at some nebulous time in between the Gormod part and the meeting with Morag part of Chapter 4. And that's just because Lila had been seen doing things in Alba Kavanagh, and the suspect for that was Poppy, so obviously Tora would get a notoriety and probably a bounty increase from that, which I would say would finally be enough to push him past Nia and make him the second most wanted character in the Aegis party, just in time for the bounty to get completely dissolved. But then we have, after Chapter 4 is where things get really spicy, because this is when, okay, Petroka and Mikhail, they get their first bounties. Didn't see them do a whole lot besides get beaten, so they're probably going to be even less than Akos's, but again, once the whole artificial blade and collusion with Bana thing was discovered, all of Torna would probably get a bit of a bump. This bump also coincides with several party members with experience with the members of Torna and possibly Malos in the past too, getting to talk to Morag about things, so their threat level would be more easily gauged. It is also legitimately worth knowing that Nia didn't know that any of the other Torna drivers were Blades. She was just as surprised as everyone else in Chapter 6, so she would not be able to say that. The only thing about people being Blades would be Malos is another Aegis. That alone is enough to get Malos's bounty probably bigger than what Rex's was post-Mithra. So that's a big deal. Then the other members of Torna also get increases, and the hierarchy would probably be Malos, then Jin, then Akos, then Patroka and Mick, probably roughly equivalent at the bottom. And then Chapter 5 happens, and we learn that Jin is a Flesh Eater and an incredibly powerful blade, able to outmatch even Mithra. So then, Jin easily becomes the most wanted member of Torna. I don't think anyone else even gets a bounty increase from that because he's the only one that showed up. And then, we have the end of Chapter 6. Everyone is a Flesh Eater or a Blade Eater, and that is also a big deal because, well, you get Jin's true form. At this point, Malos has the lowest bounty of Torna because, you know, he doesn't even have the Aegis powers. He's more or less just a dude who can do purple sometimes. So, the hierarchy would then be Jin, then probably Akos and Patroka, because as far as we can tell, Flesh Eaters are more powerful than Blade Eaters, then Mick, then Malos. So, yeah. At this point, we've seen a couple paradigm-shifting bounty increases. Post-Chapter 4, I would say that Malos's bounty gets increased to a bit more than what Rex's was, Jin's stays a bit lower, and then everyone gets a boost, so, like, no member of Torna has less than Nia had at the beginning of Chapter 4. And Malos, while being worth the most by far, isn't wildly out of the league of Rex with Mithra. Then Chapter 5 happens, Jin becomes a Flesh Eater, he gets boosted to about where Malos is, possibly a little less, possibly a little more. Then Chapter 6 happens, the other three are boosted roughly around to where Jin and Malos are, possibly even more. I would say that they get a bigger increase, Malos gets nothing, because while he's still a valuable target, he doesn't have his Aegis powers, so he is easily the weakest member. But Jin, being able to pull out his true form, which completely destroys the party even with Mithra, is a huge paradigm shift and is another at least factor of 2, if not order of magnitude bounty increase. And then the whole Jin-Malos rubber banding thing comes back, because once Malos gets his Aegis powers back, he obviously would get increased about to where Jin is, and then after that, the only increases are some sort of like blanket multiplier or additive thing to all of the members of Torna because, you know, they're doing the world tree thing. And that's all of that. So, what about the actual numbers? How am I going to do this? I'm basically going to do something extremely simple and say that all of these bounties are not personal bounties, they're posted by a government. And if 100,000 is enough for someone who used to be rich and is part of a terrorist organization operating out of a pirate ship to call piddly, then 1 million is not an unreasonable low bounty. And also 1 million is not an unreasonable amount of money for you to be able to earn just by digging up treasure. So while gameplay is obviously completely segregated from story, it's still a thing, and 500,000 is what's considered a ludicrously high price for a single core crystal. So I would say bounties on terrorists, 1 million is unreasonable. All that being said, we're going to set the lowest of the initial bounties at 1 million, and then basically just scale things off of that. So basically what I'm going to say is, at the very beginning of Chapter 2, Nia will be 1 million, and Jin and Malos will both be 3. Keep in mind that while I said this isn't a One Piece video at the beginning, that's more or less the logic I'm using. I don't know how, like, real governments do bounties or scaling reward money for aiding catching criminals and stuff, so I'm going off of the thing I know, and that's it. Don't take this too seriously. Then, afterwards, we'll say at the end of Chapter 3, Nia will go up to 2 million, Rex would be 1 to 1.5, and Tor would probably be 500k to 850k. I think that's pretty reasonable. At the end of Chapter 3 is the first big paradigm shift, because I can pretty reasonably say that Rex would shoot up to at least past 10 million just based on Mithra existing. So that's a big deal. I don't even know if I'd want anyone more than half of his, so I might even say Rex is up to 15 million. Then we've got Jin probably at like 6, Malos at like 5, Nia at like 4, and Akos and Tora at like 3. So that's a big deal. Really big deal. Then at the beginning of chapter 4, it's probably not going to be a big boost to any of the party members. I don't even know if Rex is going to go up at all. Like, he's not going to go up all the way to 20 million from that. He might get like 1 or 2 more, and then Nia and Tora might get like a few 100,000 to 1 more. So I'm not even going to count that. However, I would say that directly before the arrival in Albucavernic, Tora would get up to like 5 million just because of all the things that Lila did and were blamed on him. And then at the end of chapter 4 is where the funky things start happening, because the actual ceiling isn't going to get raised at all, but Torna is going to basically take all of the places that Rex's party initially had. So we're going to end up with the Malos at like the 15 million, Jin will go up to like 7 or 8, then I'd say like Akos at 5 and Batroka and Mick at like 4. Now, people just kind of entering the system already at higher than what Jin and Malos initially had might be weird, but they're established allies of Jin and Malos capable of fighting on a reasonably similar level to them, so yeah. Then once we see Jin the Flesh Eater in chapter 5, the wacky things happen, so like, this is where Jin catches straight up to Malos, so he's probably at 15 to 20. He's probably 20 because he did more devastating things than Malos ever did. Like, Vendem, big mercenary guy, Jin straight up beat Mithra, who Malos lost to after killing Vendem, and killed Haze, so you probably get the extra Indal anger money in there too. Then Malos is roughly the same, he might go up to like 16, and then the rest are still not huge, but I'd say you got Akos, Patroka, and Mick all hanging around in the 7 to 9 range. Then Jin goes really big at the end of chapter 6, and that's like 40 to 50, so, you know, really big deal, big paradigm shift. I'm considering paradigm shift to be like multiples by 2, because that's a really big deal, so he gets a really big number for the really big deal, because it's a really big deal. I should probably stop padding this video, it's already half an hour long, but anyway, so Jin gets the really big number, and then all of the other people being flesh eaters puts them past Malos. So Malos is like 16-ish. The other guys are probably where Jin was before, because before Jin pulled out his true form, he was just normal, powerful flesh eater tier, and those guys are all normal, powerful flesh eater tier, so they're all at like 20, 25, Malos is at like 16, Jin is like 40 to 50. Then, at the end of chapter 7, all of that stuff happens, Malos gets his power back. I would say Jin doesn't get an increase because he sort of takes an L there, but Malos catches back up to Jin, so we got 2 guys in the 40-50 range, and the other 3 are smaller. And at the point where they're starting to climb the world tree, and Mikhail, who's like the weakest one, is able to fight all of Indal at once, I think we could just say, screw it, let's add another 0 onto everyone and double Jin and Malos, because they're by far the strongest 2 now. So that's like, we just straight up have Jin and Malos in the billion range, and then the others are several 100 million. So, like, if Rex actually cashed in the bounty on any of them, then he'd be able to buy several 100 salvaging suits. And I think that's a funny place to stop. So until next time, this is Luxon timing out. I'm keeping that in, because I don't care anymore. Goodbye. The video's over. Go home.